All right, this is one of those messages I came up this morning as I was studying. Kind of things started coming to my head, so it was kind of not sure where we're going to go with this, but it kind of ties in with what the lesson that we just had. There's so much confusion in those who call themselves Christians today. So many different beliefs, so many denominations. It's really chaos, and that is not by chance. It's not it's not by it just happened that way. It's not a coincidence. That would be what Satan would have, is chaos and confusion. Because when there's chaos and confusion, there's no right or wrong, there's no truth, there's no authority. Right. Those that would choose to have anarchy and chose to have lawlessness, they thrive in that because they're their own boss and nobody can tell them what to do. They have no authority. If there's chaos, if there's confusion, if there's anarchy, if there's no judgment, if there's no law, there's no right and there's no wrong, then there's everybody's their own God, and that is not how God operates. And I want to just look at that, and we're going to start some things. And I've done this study before, but maybe it might come out a little different, and we may end up a different place. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, there's a statement about God here that I want to just kind of take out of the context, but the truth of who God is still here. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, the context here has to do with when the Corinthians were coming together. It was chaotic. When they were coming together to assemble like we are now, there was no order. Everybody was getting up at the same time. There were people talking over one another. Some people were talking in a different language, and nobody knew what they were saying, and nobody was interpreting it. And it was just chaotic. And Paul is, along with a lot of other things in the book of Corinthians, he's correcting them on something. And so, if you'll notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, in verse 26, 1 Corinthians 14:26, how is it then, brethren, when ye come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation? Let all things be done unto edifying. If any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by two, or at the most by three, and that by course, and let one interpret. But if there be no interpreter, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Let the prophets, those would be that would stand up and the preacher or the teacher. Let the prophets speak, two or three, and let the other judge. If anything be revealed to another that sitteth by, let the first hold his peace. In other words, one speak at a time. One thing at a time. For ye may all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be comforted. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. In other words, somebody say, well, the Holy Spirit just hit me and I had to stand up. Well, that's not what that verse says. They're subject to them. For God, verse 33, here is a characteristic of God. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints. God is not the author of confusion. So wherever there is confusion, it's not God who brings about confusion. God brings about order. God brings about consistency and And that's how, and you see that, and he talks about that. There's a time for things. And in fact, look over in Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And I got to actually thinking about this by watching the weather. You know how, and also this whole thing about the pandemic and whatnot. People, what is science, and trust the science. And the only reason that there is a thing called science in this world is because God is a God of order. Mm-hmm. And you can predict what's going to happen next because God created order. The body, every single human body operates exactly the same way. So if you learn how the heart works in one person, it's going to work the same in the other person. It's going to happen. Everything is the same. Now, with environmental issues, things happen, but the body, the makeup of the body of humans, of squirrels, of whatever is the same. The weather. How is it that they can, the snow that we had Friday night just came kind of out of the blue, but the guy on the weather at about 12 o'clock that day at lunch, he said that at where we were going to get snow, and it was going to snow starting at about 7 o'clock, and it was going to stop about 11 o'clock. And you know what? It did. How is it? They're not psychic. Right. You know why? Because they look at trends, and they look at, because this world was created in order. Right. They know exactly when the sun's going to rise. They tell you, tomorrow the sun's going to rise at blah, 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 and it's going to set at this time. They know that because God created order. Not confusion and chaos, right, but order. And that's what Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is all about. In verse 1, to everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, sowing, harvesting, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. All this is there, and it's all about time. Time to love and a time to hate. You know, people want to talk about the characteristics of God, and they'll quote, well, God is love, and God is love, and why would a God that is of love would cause somebody to die or get sick or go to hell? Well, He's also a God of vengeance, and He's a God of wrath. He's all of those things. And time, I think it's important that time here is listed here, because time is divided. We divide time, and time is divided here. There's a time to plant, and there's a time to pluck up that which is planted. Time is divided. We divide time into hours, or actually we can go to years, and we go down to months, and we go down to days, and then we go down to hours, and then we go down to minutes, and then we go down to seconds. That's all part of order. What if there was no, what if you couldn't tell when the sun was going to shine? Well, you know, it might come up today, it might just stay dark all night, be night for, you know, it doesn't do that. It's part of this earth and part of this creation. Turn back to Genesis chapter 1. And because God is a God of order, He's a God of division. As we just said, you divide up time, you divide things in order to create order. Like when you're, like if you come to my basement, we've been trying to organize our basement because it's chaotic, it's clustered. There's a lot of stuff in there. So what do? We're down there, we're deciding, is this something we want to keep? If not, it goes in to the trash. If we're going to keep it, where are we going to put it? Because it's not going to stay right here. That's creating order. That's dividing things. That's how God operated in creation. In Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. So it was without form and it was void. It was chaotic. There was no order. There was no light. There was no form. It was without form and it was void. It was not usable. It was chaos. And the Spirit, the end of verse 2, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God, what did He do? He divided the light from the darkness. So there is a division. After the very first act of God, He divided light from darkness. Verse 5. And God called the light day. He named it. He gave it a name. He began to label things. You do that when you're organizing your basement. You get a tub, one of these storage tubs, and you put stuff in it. And if you want to know what's in it, what do? You label it. You put a name on it. You organize. He called the light day, and darkness He called night. And in the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the water. So now He's dividing water. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. There you go. He's dividing and labeling. In the evening and the morning were the second day. And in verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. He divided that. And then He called the dry land earth. He labeled. He's dividing things up and He's labeling. And the gathering together of the waters called He seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. So He began to make the grass and the fruit trees and the herbs. And He did all this. Skip down to verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Time was created in verse 14. And as soon as it was created, He divided it. He divided it into seasons and signs. And you got, people still, I know we were talking about this at work the other day. People still get the Farmer's Almanac, and it tells them when to plant in the spring. And if you don't plant at that time, you won't yield what it is. It's the season. It's the time to sow, and then there's a time at the right time again you harvest. And it's all got to do with time, and it has to do with this earth. The creation of this earth, and everything was divided, and everything has a purpose, and everything has a reason, and everything has its place, and it's very orderly. And so you continue reading all this, and all the animals were made after their time, and it's very orderly. It's interesting. I'm not going to read all of this, but it's interesting to read the next few chapters, because he gives Adam he's supposed to name all the animals. That brown one there with the long ears. That's not, and you need a name. You need to know what it is. You need to know what the name of it is. And it's all orderly. And it was all, this order continued even after the flood. Look over in Genesis chapter 8. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 20, Genesis 8:20, this is after Noah comes off the ark. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done, while the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. You know why I know the sun's going to come up in the morning if the earth is still here? Because it says it right there. There's not going to be some atomic nuclear war that's going to destroy this planet. Man's not going to destroy this planet. Man's not going to keep the sun from shining in the morning. He's not going to keep the sun from going down this evening. He's not going to keep things from growing. As much as I try in my gravel driveway to keep grass from growing, I can't keep it from growing. I have to keep spraying Roundup on it because it's going to keep coming. The earth is going to continue as it has until He creates a new heaven, destroys this one with fire, and creates a new heaven and a new earth. It's going to continue as it always has. And it is, I believe, that continuing the whole idea of man can destroy the earth with, just is a proud look. I have the power to do this, right, as humanistic belief is, when we don't have the power to do this. Now, we might wipe a lot of the humans out, but the earth is going to be here, and the earth will continue. I mean, if something, and I know it's not going to happen because it's not in the Bible, but if something were to happen and mankind would somehow get wiped off the planet, the earth ain't going anywhere. The earth will continue to do what it does because God created it that way, and that's what true science is. True science is looking at creation and seeing what God has made and figuring it out. And you can figure it out because it's consistent. There's something that Paul talks. Hold on to Genesis and turn back to Acts. I think it's in Acts. No, not in Acts. Colossians. Yes, Colossians chapter 1. In Colossians chapter 1, in verse 13, Colossians 1:13, who hath delivered us from the power of darkness, and hath translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son, in whom we have redemption through His blood, even the forgiveness of sins, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature. For by him, that would be Jesus Christ, for by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. You know, this world, this earth, wasn't created for us. Imagine that. Most people think it is. You know, we are so egocentric in our thoughts that this is somehow us. It's him. It's always been about him. It was created by him, for him. But here's the word I want to get to in verse 17. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Now, consist is not the same as exist.
Right.
Exist means that's what makes you living. Paul did say in Acts that in him we move and breathe and have our being. We exist because of him. Consist has to do with continuing.
Right. On and on.
The continuation of it. And order, in order. Because think about the word consist. And then think about the word consistent. Consistent. Consistency. What does that mean? That means it's predictable. It means it's something you can set your wants to. Mm-hmm. It is consistent. God is a God of consistency. He is a God, you can, if he says it, it's going to happen. That's what Satan would not, that's what he wants to plant doubt in your mind. That's what he did to Eve. Let's go back and look at that. Look back in Genesis. True science doesn't do that. True science is based on consistency. When you give somebody this medicine, it does this. But the human body reacts to this way. If you eat too many Big Macs, this is what's going to happen to your body. They know that because it's consistent. He makes everything consistent. By him all things consist. So Satan wants to plant doubt of the creation and consistency of God. Look at what, here at the Garden of Eden, and they're told in chapter 2, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Not that pretty cut and dry, right? Yeah. So, look in chapter 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden. And the woman said of the serpent, We may not eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden. God had said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Now she, right then, gave a clue to the serpent that she didn't really know what God said. Because he didn't say you can't touch it.
Right.
So immediately the serpent's like, oh, I got a crack in this one here. Yeah. She doesn't really know what he said. Right? So what does he do? And the serpent said, Ye shall not surely die. He contradicted what God had just said. He's trying to create confusion. He's trying to create chaos. He's trying to create doubt. He's trying to create that the God isn't consistent. You shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. In other words, God's trying to hide something from you, God knows that if you really eat this, it's going to make you smart. You're going to make you wise. It's going to make you be like the gods, which the serpent was one at that time, or had been one. And so, again, you go against God's order. When you do that, it does bring chaos and it does bring confusion. When you cross order, when you go against that which God has told to be done. And I want you to turn to chapter. Notice chapter 10 in Genesis. And after the flood, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so in chapter 10, the Bible goes through the lineage of each of these sons. Goes through the lineage of Japheth, starting in verse 2. Notice verse 5. At the end of this lineage, by these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after his families, in their nations. So the isles of the Gentiles, Japheth, right? And then in verse 6 it starts with the sons of Ham. And in verse 20 after that, these are the sons of Ham after their families, after their tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. So you have the lineage of Ham. And then the next one in verse 22 is the children of Shem. And then in verse 31, these are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongues, and their lands, after their nations. So all 3 lineages have been said, and they were to divide. Notice verse 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. The idea was these 3 lineages were to go out and they were to replenish the earth, and they were to go out and establish create nations all over the earth. That was God's plan. Like out of these 3 sons, these groups would go here, these groups, and the nations would be divided. But when you get to chapter 11, verse 1, they hadn't done that. In chapter 11, verse 1, and the whole earth was one language, and it was one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed. Who journeyed? Everybody. The whole earth. All the families of Shem, Ham, and Japheth were all clumped in together and mixed in together. They were not dividing out into the nations. God had order. God had ordered that to be the division. He divided the nations that way, and they weren't doing it. They were chaos. They were confused. They were not abiding by what God had told them to do, and therefore they began to think that they could somehow get to God by building a tower. And they began to build what's known as the Tower of Babel. And notice verse 5. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people was one, and they have all one language. And this they began to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. He confounded their language, the Tower of Babel. In other words, they couldn't understand each other anymore, and He scattered them. But it wasn't a random scattering. I believe that God scattered them to where He divided them out, to where they needed to go. In fact, hold on turn over to Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 17, and he's speaking here to at Mars Hill, to the Athenians, who are very much idol worshippers. And so he says in verse 23, in Acts 17:23, "For as I passed by and beheld your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hand, neither is worshipped with man's hands, as though he needeth anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things, and hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being." That's God. And he set the bounds of their habitation. He set it so he scattered the nations. And he made the nations where they are. I don't sit and worry about how the Native Americans got to North America. You know, they want to try to make it out like it was some bridge Alaska froze over came over. It was the ice bridge from Alaska to Russia, and they just happened to walk over here over 100,000 years or whatever. That's hard to. Why can't you just believe the Bible? God scattered them. That's how they got here. That's why there's people all over the earth. That's what Paul just said here. Look in turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 32. See, it's not science when it contradicts what the Bible says.
That's right.
It's not science. Notice in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and we'll just put a bookmark in it when I get done here. Verse 7, Deuteronomy 32 verse 7. "Remember the days of old, considered the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel."
12.
There's 12 children of Israel. So, in all thoughts, God has 12 boundaries for nations in the world, in the earth. I believe that when we have a new heaven and a new earth, and there will be 12 nations on this earth. I think 12 is that number. There's lots of reasons for it. I mean, the number 12 is prevalent with the earth. You have 12 months in a year, right? You have 12 apostles, disciples. You got 12 foundations. You look at that city that comes down out of heaven. There's 12 foundations. There's 12 gates. And we'll look at this maybe later, but the idea is there's a reason. Man don't get to decide how many nations there really are on the earth. Man don't get to decide that. God, this is His creation. Somebody can just, I'm going to make North Carolina, we're going to secede from the Union and we're going to be our own nation. Well, you might do that in political. It's just like when they created the nation of Israel over there in 1948.
Right.
That man don't get to decide that. Now, like in a political world that we live in, we do that. We divide because that's how you don't have chaos when you divide. But the whole purpose of this is why it only makes sense that the Word of God would also have division.
Right.
That God has not always saved people the same way. He's not dealt with people the same way. He's not given them the same commandments throughout time. The Word of God is divided because He is a God of order and division. So it would only make sense that His Word would be divided. And when you don't divide according to His division, you have chaos and you have confusion and you have people not worshiping God and doing what He would have us to do. So I'm going to continue. We're going to work on, we're going to go somewhere from this next time. So we'll just plan on that, hopefully, Lord willing, next week, if we're not snowed out again. All right.